Happy New Year and welcome to the LinkedIn Live broadcast on the release of the ISM Manufacturing PMI Report. My name is Dan Zeiger. I'm Senior Writer and Editor for Inside Supply Management. That's Institute for Supply Management's member publication. And we're glad that you've joined us as we discuss the Manufacturing PMI for December. Amid improved but still cool demand, U.S. factories ended 2025 with the same sluggishness as well as the trade and tariff anxieties that define the year. The PMI registered 47.9%. That's a 10th straight month in contraction and the lowest reading of the year. And it wasn't related to the December data, but many of us woke up to news on Saturday morning that will have an impact on manufacturing, and we'll probably discuss that over the course of our time together today. Hope you had a great holiday season at ISM. Some of us have been off for as many as 17 days. But I'm excited to get the juices flowing again with my coffee and some great discussion with Susan Spence. She's the chair of the ISM Manufacturing Business Survey Committee. So let's bring her in. Happy New Year, Susan.
Happy New Year, Dan.
A little more than 2 weeks ago, we were talking about the supply chain planning forecast and the optimism that many of the panelists have for 2026. But I mean, it really wasn't reflected in December's data. It was more of the same. Just what stood out to you?
Thank you for mentioning the 47.9 being the lowest point of the year. That struck me as well. Other things that stood out to me, but I think that they're probably less meaningful than maybe what I first thought was demand still in contraction, but the backlog new orders and new export orders all did improve slightly, but they all did. And I don't recall a time where they all happened to. I'm not sure it's totally meaningful, especially because we have not had several months in a row with a new order improvement into expansion. I also thought it was really curious that we've had 2 months of production expansion in a row until I read the panelist comments and a fair number of folks saying, listen, it's the end of the year. People, who are managing budgets, we have a thing called use it or lose it. So it could very well be year-end ordering for those companies whose fiscal year matched the calendar year. And it also, what stood out was the percent of manufacturing sector share in contraction, 85% this year, this month. It's a big amount. And then 43% in strong contraction versus 39%. So that's worrisome. And if I sit back and think about the buildup from the February, March, timeframe when things started to go south after the first tariff announcements came out, it just seems to be a accumulation, if you will, of uncertainty, chaos, not understanding what the next administration policy is going to be. And as our panelists have continued to tell us, sentiment's not great, right? For every positive comment, we're still at 3.5 that are negative. For everyone that's feeling, pretty good because they can hire people, there's 3 that's not. Demand softening is, more of 1-to-1, but new export orders, every positive comment, there's 1.5 negative. So I feel like it's accumulation of the year. And the other thing that I looked at, and I talked about earlier in our press conference, was if you look sector by sector, those sectors that have been in expansion versus contraction this year, here's some things that stand out. Chemical products, which go into virtually everything, they were only in expansion 3 months of the last 12 and not since April. So that's worrisome. Computer electronics products, contrarily, have been in expansion 6 months and a steady uptick since July. And so we've been talking for some time about, could it be the data center build out? And if the data center build out is the cause, what happens when those are complete? What happens if some will say the data center and AI bubble is about to happen? There's some really interesting opinions and op-eds out about that. But if you look at some of the other categories like petroleum and coal products, 9 out of 12 months, it's been expanding. Now what happens, with the recent news on Venezuela? And oh, by the way, out of the big 6 categories, petroleum is 5% of manufacturing GDP, while chemical products is 20%. So I look at those trends. I look at even more dire news for uncertainty and global uncertainty with Venezuela. And I feel like we're in for more of the same. Maybe the single biggest change would be what happens with the Supreme Court tariff ruling. No idea when that's going to come. My understanding is it could take till the summer. So I think that's where we're sitting at. And while we'd love to be optimistic about 2 months in a row of production expansion, we're not seeing it happen on the front end with new orders. So I think we got a 2-month bubble there, but I would expect it to flatten out next month.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about a couple of specific, you mentioned this on some of the earlier interviews that we did, and I would imagine that we'll talk about it. It's an opportunity to look back on the year and the trends that evolved and what could be coming in 2026, and we'll talk about that. But let's talk a little bit about the December data first. You had mentioned the demand, that there were some slight upticks in 3 of those key indexes, and customers' inventory still being too low. But there were a couple of indexes readings that, we'll start with employment. It registered 44.9% in December. That's in contraction, 18 of the last 19 and 37 of the last 44 months. And in December, just 9% of the companies that were surveyed reported adding staff. I mean, it just seems to me that that's just another clear sign that, companies are not going to believe demand is back until they see it. I mean, is that a fair evaluation?
Yeah. And they're not, they're not going to replace folks. They're not going to expand unless their industry happens to be one of the ones that is expanding. Like I said, the ratio there is every person hiring, there's 3 that are not. There's been some very interesting commenting. I read something recently about a very unusual low hire, low fire environment that we're in. That's nothing in my report. I read it about a month and a half ago. So for whatever, for the reasons that we've already cited, we may be done with big sweeping layoffs, but we're not hiring people, and we're certainly not backfilling them for most industries. So, you can look at things like jobless claims and continuing jobless claims and BLS data, even though it's been outdated, certainly because of the shutdown. But the companies they're still not investing in capital. They're not expanding. They're not hiring. They're hanging on and waiting to see what happens. And again, if you don't have new order flow, it would be irresponsible to hire folks, right? There was an interesting comment from a transportation equipment provider about, folks are just they're talking about commercial fleet. They're just going to let their fleet age and just hang on for some more time. So there needs to be an improvement. It needs to be sustained for more than a month, and we're not seeing it. And we don't know when we will see it. And, more to come on, what the implications are from the Venezuela issue we're seeing. I got asked plenty about that, as you heard in some of the press conferences, and not just with regard to what do we think is going to happen in petroleum, right?
Yeah. Well, yeah, we'll touch on that a little bit later because, it's not going to be simple, by any means. I don't think everyone agrees on that, but yeah, it's going to have some implications on not only the petroleum sector that you mentioned, but also the manufacturing sector as a whole. Another index number that stood out to me, and if you do the math, it was the one that had the biggest impact on the PMI in December was inventories. That was down 3.7 percentage points, down to 45.2%. Only 2 of 18 industries reported inventories growth in December. It just seems like they're not buying either. They're not hiring and they're not buying. They're just simply dipping into the stock that they have on hand.
Right. So, inventory certainly could be a drag on earnings. Inventory has a carrying cost, it's different per sector, I'm sure. But if you're not seeing a new order trend up, then obviously you're not buying the goods to support that, and again, a 2-month production blip might be, as we said earlier, people ordering because it's year end and they want to use up their budget so that doesn't get cut, but it doesn't seem to be a trend that holds, right? One other interesting thing, I'm not certain everybody knows, but the GDP number came out at a 4.4, much better and people cheered that on. I'm not certain everyone realizes that imports are taken out of that factor and that calculation. So if you've been watching imports and they're very, very low, if you had, I just use simple math, if you had 100 million in GDP and normally 10 million of it is imports, that gives you 90. If only 1 million is imports because imports are way down, then that gives you 99. And so if you stripped out, the factor of imports, did GDP really increase or not? So I just want folks to understand what goes into some of these calculations so they aren't misled or, misunderstand what that calculation is. And we don't mean to be doom and gloom. We just want to make sure people understand caution. Companies are being cautious. They need to be cautious. And uncertainty is the enemy of business. And we got a whole lot of that now and more coming.
Yeah. Yeah, Sue mentioned imports. We'll give you just our index number on it and just, to give you an idea of the trend that she spoke of. We registered 44.6% in December. That was a decrease of 4.3 percentage points compared to November. That is a 9th straight month of contraction. So that gives you an idea of the trend that she was speaking about. I know every month it seems the panelist comment stands out to me, and I run it by you and get your thoughts on it. So we've reached that time in our broadcast where that's going to happen. And it was from a panelist in chemical products. It was the very first comment that was listed in the report. He or she writes, winding up the year with mixed results. It has not been a great year. We have had some success holding the line on costs. However, real consumer spending is down and tariffs are ultimately to blame. I hope for some return to free trade, which is what customers or consumers have voted for with their spending. We've discussed industry trends from 2025. We'll probably talk about it a little bit more before we wrap up today, but just talk about how this sentiment on trade and the tariffs especially really define the year, and it's not going away.
And I love the last line, not because it's positive and makes you feel good. It's just a really, really great way to kind of characterize it. Consumers have voted with their spending. They're not. And if you look at the University of Michigan Consumer Sentiment Index, really, really important. I don't put that in my report, but it's something I look at. The Index of Consumer Sentiment from University of Michigan study is at 53.3. 1 year ago, it was 74. The current economic conditions, there's current and expectations for the future. The current economic condition is down to 50.7. I think it might be the lowest ever. It was 75 a year ago. And if the index of consumer expectations, what people think about the near-term future is not much better at 55, 73.3 a year ago. So down between 25 and 32%, right? That does not bode well for consumer procurement. We don't see the interest rate cuts that have happened really spurring about a bunch of capital investment because of why? Uncertainty. I don't have order book coming. I'm not seeing my backlog do anything but a blip here and there. And so we are where we are. And the story is still about tariffs. Are they going to stick? Are they going to be unwound? If they're unwound, will they come up in another format, perhaps at the commodity level? Or for another 150 days. So economic uncertainty driven by policy changes and other world, shaking events like the Venezuela issue is not helping anybody. And the manufacturing industry is responding. So we are there. I think we're going to be there for a while. And that's kind of, I guess, our take on it.
Yeah.
Not good. Not good.
Well, yeah. We've alluded to it multiple times. Let's just get to the question because you were definitely asked about it today. It's definitely at the top of the news roundups right now. I mean, the U.S. operation to remove Venezuela's president. It's likely going to set off a power struggle for control of that company's resources, particularly in oil. And whatever process emerges, I think it's not going to be simple, quick, or cheap. So that's a big topic discussion in your earlier interviews today, as we pointed out. I mean, just, discuss what it could mean for, I know there's a lot of unknowns, but what it could potentially mean for not only the petroleum and coal products industry, but also the manufacturing sector as a whole.
Yeah, man, is it packed? Like you said, Saturday morning we woke up and, the chances of getting asked about it today were 100%.
Yeah.
So you try to prepare. I'm just going to quote some of the reading I did over the weekend, and it talked about why Venezuela matters, right? They talked about the range of, cost per barrel of oil, 60 to 150 is a range. And, in my last years at FedEx, I saw it at both levels, right? Because we bought fuel and sometimes that would swing earnings. And luckily we had something called a fuel surcharge so we could isolate it. But it talked about 303 billion barrels that Venezuela sits on. And at 150, I think the math was $45 trillion. It talked about $45 trillion being something like 60% of the world GDP, bigger than the Magnificent Seven combined, and why that is so meaningful. So you start thinking about, U.S. companies going in to go fix infrastructure that's been, deteriorating for decades, I guess. And I think about what would encourage a U.S. company to want to go in there? Yes, the prize is oil, but you have a few years left on this administration. You have folks saying that what was done was not legal, and I'm sure that'll be battled out. If you're an ExxonMobil, Chevron, whatever, and you're going to be motivated to go in there and fix things and reap the benefit of that, think about the risk with that. Think about, would you do that? Wouldn't you need to have an assurance of some sort that you weren't going to just throw away billions of dollars? And so how likely is it that that will happen? It's just what you think about, but then the stakes being absolutely enormous with the value of that. So anyway, I'm just encouraging people to read everything you can from reputable sources, study history, right? The connection to Cuba is really, really interesting. I was not aware of that. Started reading some things this morning about that. So will it impact the U.S. economy? I think it absolutely will. Will it impact in a way where we're going to, be flush because now we're sitting on these resources that some have quoted and been and have said, that was ours. I don't get it. I don't get it. But it's more uncertainty. Again, I'm going to keep coming back to that. It's more uncertainty. And what commodities and products are impacted by the price of oil? A whole bunch, as you have seen when it was 150 a barrel versus 60. So uncertainty, not good. It's it doesn't appear to me that it's going to spurn great investment, right? And again, we're going to go back to something maybe oversimplified. What's going to cause a customer to order and to keep ordering every month so that we can fill the pipe back in production, pipeline, and eventually hiring, inventories, imports, the whole bit.
Yeah. Well, let's go back to the December data. I mean, we pointed this, we've talked about it, and I wanted to give our viewers just the numbers if they haven't seen them. You talked about some of the three demand indexes and how they showed improvement. They're still in contraction, but showed improvement. New orders went from 47.4 in November to 47.7. So that's up slightly. Backlog of orders up 1.8 percentage points from 44 in November to 45.8. New export orders up 0.6 of a percentage point, 46.2 to 46.8. And also, as we like to point out, customers' inventories remained in too low territory. That, in fact, it was even more too low, if that makes sense, down to 43.3. But as we pointed out in previous broadcasts, I mean, we've been saying that for months. Companies eventually have to reorder, and it hasn't quite happened yet. I know I over the course of the last couple of years, I talked with your predecessor, Tim Fiore, on these calls. We're looking for rays of sunshine, I guess, from month to month, and I guess you can point to that one. But as you alluded earlier in the broadcast, it might just be end of year stuff, But just talk about it. Is it just a ray of sunshine? Is it give us the lay of the land?
I think I was reflecting on the semi-annual report and the optimism that these same panelists showed. I think they predicted a 4.4% revenue increase. And, my gut was, but we've not been optimistic all year. What makes us think? And maybe it's the thing that some of us do at the year end and try to put the whole year in perspective. So we want to be optimistic, I think, as humans. But the more I think about it, the more I'm thinking, it's probably end of the year ordering, use your budget or lose it. Like we've said, I know I did that as an executive many, many times. And I guess we'll see in January. So production holding and expansion, slightly in expansion territory, a few months in a row makes sense if you believe that all the new ordering was, end of the year, get stuff in. And in some cases, maybe customer inventory so low. So we say at some point they have to order, or do they? Right? The comment from transportation equipment about the fleet, and I'm just going to let it age because I don't know what's going to happen. Transportation, both the services, logistics, and equipment are bellwethers like chemical products because they're moving goods. And so if the goods are less and they're not moving, and that's not inspiring people to invest in modernizing and upgrading their fleet, then they're going to hold back on it. So I think these things all work in concert together. I think next month will be a little more telling, and maybe there'll be more news on what's going on globally. But that index of consumer sentiment worries me. What people will do worries me. The GDP number looking like it boosted, but then consider imports coming out worries me. And I'm not naturally pessimistic, but I'm looking for patterns in data and seeing a ray of sunshine that has actually got some legs to it. Don't see it yet. Don't see it yet. So money goes where it's treated well, they say. And so far, we're not seeing it. I really do hope for a Supreme Court ruling soon so that one way or the other, that uncertainty, being, finally resolved, perhaps that changes things. And maybe it's going to be upheld and we're just going to be paying more for things.
Sure.
But it won't at least be uncertain anymore. I'm not wishing for that outcome, but knowing what's going to happen so that companies can fix the prices so they can make a reasonable profit is going to be important. And then we all have to get used to that new normal. But the whole, it's on, it's off, it's on, it's off, maybe not. It's not good.
Yeah. You alluded to this, these trends in your opening observations on what stood out to you in the data. You talked about some of the big six manufacturing industries, and some of the trends that they were in expansion, how many months throughout the year. Just as a tutorial for our viewers, those six industries are computer and electronic products, chemical products, transportation equipment, food, beverage, and tobacco products, machinery, and petroleum and coal products. Any other trends or dynamics there that stood out to you, in terms of their performance in 2025 and, what could be coming in 2026? Obviously, those are six industries that are really important to the manufacturing sector.
Just a reminder, the number one at 20% of GDP is chemical products. The number two is transportation equipment, 16%. 36% of manufacturing GDP represented by the two sectors that were in expansion for the least amount of time. 3 months out of 12 for chemical, 4 months out of 12 for transportation equipment. That is meaningful. The third biggest at 12% of GDP, computer and electronic products in expansion for 6 months. If you believe it was just due largely to data center, and if you believe data center build out is either soon to be complete or a bubble, that's 48% of GDP on those top three. Okay. So that is worrisome if you're a worrier, right? Yeah. And you got to pay attention to the trend. So we'll continue.
It kind of expresses more light. I mean, you also mentioned this in your opening. I had a question about, because it was an eye-popping number to me. I mean, 85% of manufacturing GDP contracting in December, the industries and their share of GDP that you just cited. I mean, that gives you an idea of how that was possible.
Yeah. I mean, I'm a little nerdy. Numbers matter, patterns matter. And if you look at them, you start to see things. And sometimes things aren't explainable. But again, to me, it explains the numbers. It explains why we can be pessimistic about a 1 month, pop up in production or new orders. And we look for the ray of sunshine, but we don't want to be so blinded looking and hoping and being desperate for it that we ignore other trends. It's about uncertainty driven by tariffs, driven by economic policy, driven by world political policy. That is not friendly to business. It is not good. And my hope is that folks making decisions consider, not everything in the world, but the impact on the economy. If you want to drive the economy, then you got to look at the underlying things that make it move or not. So hopefully folks are doing that with facts and history, and we'll see.
Yeah.
We'll see what happens.
Yeah, well, we'll end with this on a traditional question that I typically ask. You talked about the people making the decisions. And so, yeah, we'll finish up before, if I'm a CEO or high executive or, what should I know or take away from the data? Maybe it's something that we haven't talked about or that I haven't asked, anything that people should know before we wrap up here.
Well, you're very thorough. I
Thanks.
I can't think of anything more. Pay attention to data, read just about everything, get your hands on. It's just, I'm a big reader. I'm reading on things that I maybe didn't pay as much attention to when I was working. You do have more time in retirement. It's a blessing. But study history and what's gone on, understand what drives what.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean that you could fix things, but you got to be nimble enough as the CEO, the CFO, the supply manager to, be able to know what's a good risk, what should you hold back on. Yeah.
Well, that's a good way to wrap it up. I mean, we're going to wrap up a couple minutes earlier, but I imagine many of our viewers have a lot of work to catch up on after the break. So, give them a couple minutes back. So, hey, Susan, thanks a lot. I appreciate it. And we'll talk to you next month.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Yeah. Happy New Year.
Yeah. And thanks for joining us today, and join us on Wednesday when we break down the ISM Services PMI report for December with Steve Miller. He's the chair of ISM Services Services Business Survey Committee. So for Sue Spence and the people who helped us behind the scenes, their names are Christina Cahill and Jennifer Stevens. I'm Dan Zeiger, and we'll see you on Wednesday.